A black soldier returns home, only to face a new battle. He had spent months overseas, serving his country, enduring the chaos of war, and counting down the days until he could finally step foot on American soil again. Home. But the moment Sergeant David Cole stepped into the airport, everything changed. At first, it was just the usual commotion. Families reuniting, business travelers rushing, the hum of announcements overhead. But then, out of nowhere, a police officer stepped in his path. "Sir, I need you to step aside." David blinked, confusion flickering across his exhausted face. "Is there a problem, officer?" The cop didn't answer right away. Instead, his gaze raked over David's uniform, his neatly packed duffel bag, his dog tags gleaming under the fluorescent lights. And then, his voice sharpened. "I asked you to step aside." People were starting to stare. David kept his voice calm. "With all due respect, sir, I just landed from deployment. I have my papers." The officer cut him off. "Do I look like I care where you came from?" The words landed like a slap. A woman nearby gasped. A child clutched their mother's hand. David felt the heat rise in his chest. But he had been trained for this. Stay calm. Stay composed. But when the officer grabbed his bag without warning, dumping its contents onto the airport floor, the humiliation set in. His medals, his neatly folded fatigues, even a small photo of his mother scattered across the ground like trash. David clenched his fists. He wanted to speak, to push back, to demand an answer. But he knew how this went. And he knew that one wrong move, just one, could cost him more than his dignity. And then, just 7 minutes later, it did. Because by the time his commanding officer arrived, by the time the situation escalated, by the time someone finally realized who he was, the damage had already been done. And the cop? Fired on the spot. But what happened next? No one saw it coming. Because this wasn't just about David. It was about every black soldier who had fought for a country that still didn't see them as equal. And now? Now, the whole world was watching. Stay with me. Because this is a story you need to hear. The air inside Flight 355 hummed with the quiet industry of boarding. Passengers shuffled into their seats. Overhead bins slammed shut, and the metallic voice of the pilot droned over the intercom, promising clear skies. The first-class cabin, however, held a different kind of silence. It was the polished hush of businessmen flipping through newspapers, the rhythmic tapping of a manicured hand on a leather briefcase, the soft click of a watch being adjusted. Small, expensive movements of people accustomed to spaces like this. Chloe Bennett, a flight attendant with more than a decade in the skies, moved through the aisle with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen it all. But something held her back. It was subtle at first. A hesitation she barely noticed until she was already staring. The man in seat 3A. He was alone. That wasn't unusual. He was quiet. That wasn't either. He was reading a real book. Not a tablet or a phone. Just sitting there, turning pages with a patience that felt almost deliberate. There was nothing about him that should have been unusual. And yet, he stood out. It wasn't just his stillness. It was something else. Something deeper. Something Chloe had been trained to notice. Or at least, something she had learned to trust in her years of flying. A feeling. A whisper of unease curling at the edges of her mind. She stole another glance as she passed, her gaze flicking to the briefcase at his feet. Worn leather. The kind that had traveled. That had seen things. The man himself. Tall, lean, well-dressed but not ostentatiously so. A dark suit. Simple. Nothing flashy. And yet, he didn't fit. Not here. Not in first class. Chloe told herself she was being irrational. But the feeling sat in her stomach. A slow, growing weight. She glanced over at her fellow flight attendant, Maddie, who was pouring drinks at the galley. Leaning in, she whispered, "See the guy in 3A?" Maddie followed her gaze and then shrugged. "What about him?" "I don't know," Chloe admitted. "Something's off." Maddie arched a brow. "Off how?" Chloe hesitated. How could she explain a feeling? The man had done nothing suspicious. He had checked in like everyone else. His ticket was valid. His ID matched. And yet, he's too quiet, she finally said. Maddie gave her a look. Half amused, half exasperated. Too quiet? Since when is that a crime? Chloe crossed her arms, shifting on her feet. You know what I mean. He doesn't, she stopped herself. Because she knew what she had been about to say. He doesn't look like he belongs here. The thought chilled her, not because she had it, but because she didn't know where it had come from. Was it the contrast? The simplicity of his presence against the finely tuned artifice of first class? Or was it something older? Something deeper? Something unspoken but understood? Something she had never questioned until now. Maddie sighed. Chloe, you're seeing ghosts. He's probably a professor or something. Maybe a writer. Maybe he just doesn't like small talk. Chloe forced a nod, but as she walked away, she couldn't help but glance back. The man in 3A didn't look up, didn't shift, didn't acknowledge her at all. And yet, she felt, deep in her bones, that he already knew she was watching. There were rules, spoken and unspoken, rules that govern spaces like this. First-class cabins, private clubs, the refined silence of wealth and privilege. And then there were other rules. The ones that had never been written down but had been carved into the marrow of American life. Shaping the way people moved, the way they saw, the way they judged. Chloe Bennett had never thought of herself as someone who obeyed those unspoken rules. She liked to believe she saw people for who they were, not for what they appeared to be. And yet, here she was, standing near the galley, unable to shake the unease curling through her ribs like smoke. She stole another glance at the man in 3A. Nothing had changed. He still sat there, still turning pages with the same measured patience, still existing in the same quiet that had unsettled her from the beginning. But the longer she watched, the more she realized, it wasn't just his silence. It was what his silence represented. Most first-class passengers took up space. They spread out, and made their presence known. They expected things, drinks, attention, deference. But he was different. He moved carefully, deliberately, as if aware that his presence alone was enough to make people look twice. As if he had spent a lifetime learning how to take up less space. The thought lodged itself in Chloe's throat. She turned abruptly and reached for the intercom, her fingers pressing down on the call button before she could second-guess herself. "This is Flight 355, she said, keeping her voice low. "We have a passenger in first class. Seat 3A. Something feels off. I'd like someone to check it out before we take off." There was a pause on the other end. What exactly is the concern? Chloe hesitated. She had no answer, no tangible reason to justify what she was doing. She had only the feeling, the weight of her own uncertainty pressing against her ribs like a stone. "I just need someone to verify," she said finally, "just in case." The response was immediate. "We'll send security." She hung up, exhaling sharply. Maddie, who had been watching, folded her arms. "You really called it in?" Chloe avoided her gaze. "It's just a precaution." Maddie sighed. "And what happens when they check him and find out he's just a guy reading a book?" Chloe swallowed hard. "Then I'll deal with it." But deep down, she wasn't sure what was worse. The possibility that she was right. Or the possibility that she was terribly, shamefully wrong. Minutes passed. The hum of the cabin continued. Undisturbed, passengers tucked themselves into their seats, flipping through magazines, adjusting their watches, settling into the quiet comfort of being people who belonged. And then, like a slow-moving storm, the presence of authority changed the air. 2 uniformed officers boarded the plane. Their movements were careful, but their presence was undeniable. The murmur of conversation among the passengers dimmed, replaced by the sharp edge of curiosity, of speculation. Chloe turned, her breath catching as they moved down the aisle, their eyes sweeping over the rows until they landed on 3A. The man looked up. He did not flinch. He did not ask why they were there. He simply closed his book, folded his hands neatly in his lap, and waited. And that, more than anything else, made Chloe's pulse quicken. Because if he were guilty, he would have protested. If he had something to hide, he would have looked away. But instead, he sat there, meeting the weight of their scrutiny with the kind of patience that only came from a lifetime of being watched. One of the officers cleared his throat. "Sir, we need to ask you a few questions." The man nodded once. His voice was even, calm. Of course. He stood, moving with the kind of grace that made Chloe suddenly, terribly aware of what she had done. And as the officers led him toward the front of the plane, the whispers began. What's going on? Who is he? I knew something was off about him. Chloe heard them all. But the worst voice was the one in her own head. The one whispering a truth she did not want to face. This had never been about what the man in 3A had done. It had only ever been about who he was. The plane's hum had changed. It was no longer the smooth, effortless rhythm of departure, of people sinking into the illusion of safety at 30,000 feet. It was something else now. Something jagged, something sharp-edged. The man from 3A, the man Chloe had reported, was gone, taken off the plane by security. His briefcase in one hand, his composure held as steady as a glass of water on a table that had been shaken but not yet overturned. And yet, the balance of everything had shifted. Passengers turned to one another, their whispers thick with speculation. Did you see him? I knew something was off. They wouldn't take him off if they didn't have a reason. These days, you can't be too careful. The voices wove themselves together, knitting a collective certainty out of nothing but suspicion. Chloe heard every word. She wished she didn't. Maddie leaned against the galley, arms crossed tight over her chest. You don't look happy, she said, voice low. Chloe exhaled, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. They'll check him out. If there's nothing wrong, he'll come back. Maddie studied with her. And if there was nothing wrong, what exactly made you think something was? Chloe's mouth opened, then closed. Because the truth, the unbearable truth, was that she had no answer. She had followed a feeling. And yet, she knew, deep down, she knew, that if the man in 3A had been dressed just a little differently, or if his skin had been just a little lighter, that feeling never would have arrived. That realization sat in her stomach like a stone. The minutes dragged on. The plane remained still. The passengers, businessmen with loosened ties, an older woman leafing through a novel, a young couple whispering between themselves, waited. And then the whispers shifted. The murmuring died down, replaced by something heavier. A moment later, he returned. The man from 3A stepped back onto the plane. He walked with the same deliberate calm as before, his briefcase still in his hand, his face unreadable. But there was something about him now. Something different. Not anger, not defiance. Something quieter. A knowing. He did not look at Chloe. Did not glance at the passengers who had murmured their judgments in his absence. He simply walked back to his seat, placed his briefcase down, and sat. The whispers returned, but now they carried a different tone. A shift. They let him back on? So, was it just a mistake? Why'd they even stop him in the first place? Chloe turned away, staring down at the tray of neatly stacked plastic cups in the galley. She felt Maddie's gaze on her, but she didn't look up. She didn't want to see what was in her colleague's eyes. Because she already knew. Because she was afraid of what she'd find in her own reflection. She had made a call. She had followed a feeling. And now, the man she had feared sat no more than 10 feet away. Knowing that she had done it, the plane had not yet left the ground. But Chloe had never felt so trapped. The plane was in the air now. But for Chloe, it felt like she had never left the ground. She moved through the aisle, performing the same tasks she had done 1,000 times before. Adjusting seat belts, offering drinks, flashing polite, automatic smiles. And yet, everything felt different. Every action felt heavier. Because now, the man in 3A was back. And he knew. She had expected anger, a look of accusation, some sign that he carried the weight of what had happened. But instead, nothing. He sat there, still and composed, as though the last 30 minutes had never happened. As though being pulled off a plane, questioned like a criminal, and then allowed to return was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. That, more than anything, unnerved her. Because anger, she could have understood. Anger would have been human. But this quiet acceptance? It meant that he had lived this before. That realization crawled under her skin, settling into the cracks of her certainty. She moved past him, but not before she caught his eye. His gaze was calm, But not empty, not indifferent, measured, knowing. Chloe's breath caught. She turned away quickly, but the weight of his stare lingered. She retreated to the galley, where Maddie was already waiting for her, arms crossed. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she murmured. Chloe leaned against the counter, exhaling slowly. "It's nothing." Maddie raised an eyebrow. "Nothing? That man just walked back onto this plane after being dragged off in front of 100 people. And now, instead of being mad, he's just sitting there, watching." Chloe swallowed. "I don't know what to say to him." Maddie gave her a long look. "Maybe you don't need to say anything." Chloe shook her head. "No, She hesitated. The words caught in her throat. "I didn't mean, quote." Maddie didn't let her finish. "Didn't mean what, Chloe?" Her voice was softer now, but still edged with something sharp. Chloe had no answer. Because meaning was irrelevant. Meaning didn't stop the officers from walking down the aisle. Meaning didn't keep the whispers from spreading. Meaning didn't erase the fact that she had made a call that could have changed the course of a man's life in an instant. She turned away, gripping the counter. She wanted to shake the feeling. Wanted to tell herself that it was just a mistake. A miscalculation. But she could feel the truth pressing in on her like a rising tide. This wasn't just about her. This was about how the world worked. She had played her part. She had followed the script. The one she had never been taught but had always known. And now, she was seeing it for what it was. A pause crackled over the intercom. Then the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting smooth skies for the remainder of the flight. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the journey." Chloe clenched her jaw. Smooth skies. For everyone but him. The plane cut through the sky. Steady and indifferent. The cabin hummed with the low murmur of conversation. The occasional clink of ice against glass. The rustle of magazines turning pages. But Chloe heard none of it. Her mind was trapped in a loop. Circling, spiraling, replaying the moment she made the call. The moment the officers stepped onto the plane. The moment he stood, silent and composed, and followed them. And now he was back. In 3A. His presence an unspoken indictment. She stole another glance as she passed him. But he remained as he was. Reading. Occasionally glancing at his watch. His expression unreadable. No anger. No confrontation. Just patience. And that patience was what disturbed her most. Because it meant he expected this. It meant that for him, this wasn't an incident. It was routine. And what does it do to a man? Chloe wondered. To walk through the world knowing that, at any moment, someone could look at you. Just look at you. And decide you don't belong? She carried the weight of what she had done in her chest. Heavy and unmoving, she moved through the cabin. Her motions automatic. A woman in 5B asked for tea. And she poured it with shaking hands. A man in 2C requested a pillow. And she retrieved it without a word. And then, an elderly woman, delicate, well-dressed, the kind who had been flying first class her whole life, flagged her down. Chloe forced a smile. "Yes, ma'am?" The woman leaned in slightly. Her voice soft but conspiratorial. "You did the right thing, dear." Chloe blinked. "Excuse me?" The woman nodded toward 3A. Careful not to be seen. "That man. It's good you were watching. You never know. These days." Chloe's stomach twisted. "You can't be too careful." The woman continued, stirring sugar into her coffee. "I mean, look how calm he is. That's what makes me nervous. The quiet ones." Something inside Chloe cracked. The quiet ones. She wanted to laugh, or scream, or run. Instead, she nodded, her face stiff, and walked away. But the woman's words clung to her like a second skin. The quiet ones. As though silence was the crime. As though dignity was the threat. As though restraint itself was evidence of guilt. She didn't look at 3A as she passed. She couldn't. Because for the first time, she saw herself in him. Not in his patience. Not in his dignity. But in his knowing. Because now, she knew, too. Knew the way the world worked. Knew how easily suspicion could slip into certainty. Knew that even now, in this moment, in the space between them, he was carrying something she would never understand. And there was no undoing it. No apology that would erase it. The only thing left was to sit with it. To know. And knowledge, Chloe realized, was its own kind of burden. The weight of knowing had settled in Chloe's chest. But the world around her moved on as if nothing had happened. Passengers laughed. Flight attendants served. The plane hummed toward its destination. And yet, the air felt different. He was still there. 3A. Still reading. Still existing with the quiet grace of a man accustomed to being both invisible and scrutinized all at once. Chloe's skin prickled with the knowledge that, had the officers not recognized his name, had his credentials not been deemed acceptable, the whispers would have changed. I knew it. You can never be too careful. Better safe than sorry. The words were waiting, always waiting, just beneath the surface, ready to solidify into certainty. And that was the truth she could no longer look away from. It wasn't about what he had done. He had done nothing. It was about who he was allowed to be. A black man in first class. A black man sitting in stillness. A black man waiting. That was enough. That was always enough. She moved toward the galley. But before she could escape into its false safety, a voice stopped her. Low, even, steady. Miss Bennet. She froze. Slowly, she turned. He was looking at her now. Directly. There was no anger in his gaze. No accusation. But there was something else. A mirror. She swallowed. Yes? He studied her for a moment, as if measuring the weight of what he was about to say. Then, softly, I hope you found what you were looking for. The words landed like a stone in her stomach. She wanted to say something. Anything. But what could she say? That she was sorry? That she had been afraid of something she couldn't even name? That she had mistaken his presence for a problem? None of it was enough. So she stood there, the silence stretching between them. And then, after a beat, he nodded, not in forgiveness, but in understanding. Because he knew. He had always known. And now, so did she. As she walked away, Chloe felt something shift inside her. Something that would not be undone. Because once a mirror has been placed before you, once you have truly seen yourself, you can never look away again. The plane moved steadily through the sky, cutting through the night like a secret whispered between strangers. But inside, Chloe felt the pressure of gravity in a way she never had before. She had spent years in the air, weightless in the space between places, between people, between moments of consequence. But now, something held her down. It was him. 3A. He had given her no scolding, no lecture, no righteous indignation, just a question. I hope you found what you were looking for. And the truth was, she had. But she didn't like what she saw. She had always thought of herself as fair, reasonable, the kind of person who made judgments based on logic, not bias. And yet, the moment had arrived, unannounced, subtle, but inevitable, and she had made a call. Not because of what he did. Because of what she saw. She felt it now, in every glance from the passengers who had seen her make that call. Had they judged her? Or worse, had they agreed? She didn't know which answer would be worse. Maddie was beside her now, pouring coffee for a passenger who barely looked up. You okay? Chloe didn't answer right away. Because no, she wasn't okay. She had seen something in herself that she couldn't unsee. Maddie followed her gaze, tracking the line of her stare until she landed on 3A. Then she sighed. You need to let it go. Chloe turned to her, blinking. What? Maddie shrugged, setting down the coffee pot. You messed up. It happens. Chloe shook her head. It shouldn't have happened. Maddie exhaled, leaning against the counter. And yet, here we are. Here we are. The words sat between them, heavy and unmoving. And Chloe understood. Maddie didn't expect her to feel guilty. Because to Maddie, this was normal. Not fair, not right, but normal. Chloe felt sick. Because wasn't that the problem? Wasn't that exactly how it continued? Not through men in white hoods. Not through laws written in ink. But through people like her. People who didn't think they were part of the problem. Until the moment arrived, and they followed the script. And then? Then they told themselves it was a mistake. Then they told themselves to move on. Then they let it go. But he, 3A, he never got to let it go. Not on this plane. Not at the airport. Not in a restaurant. Or a boardroom. or a hotel lobby. Because the next Chloe was always waiting. And she would follow a feeling. And he would be measured. Polite. Composed. Because he had to be. Because the moment he wasn't, he would become the thing they already believed him to be. A threat. Chloe closed her eyes. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to be on the other side of the looking glass. And it terrified her. Because if she had made this mistake, how many others had she never even noticed? How many times had she been the hand that tipped the scale? Without ever realizing she was holding it? The turbulence light flickered on. A small jolt shaking the plane. Chloe barely noticed. Because the real turbulence was inside her. And there was no seatbelt for this. The plane had begun its descent. But Chloe felt as if she were still falling. She moved through the cabin in a daze. Her hands working on instinct. Checking seatbelts. Gathering stray cups. Preparing for landing. But her mind was elsewhere. It was in 3A. It was at the moment she had made the call. It was in the way the world had allowed her to make that call without hesitation. Because wasn't that the lesson she had been taught all along? Not with words, but with glances, with shifts in body language, with the way people lowered their voices when certain men entered the room. This wasn't just about her. This was about a system that worked silently, efficiently, invisible, because people like her had never been forced to see it. Until now. She turned, one last time, toward 3A. He was looking out the window, watching the ground rise up to meet them. There was something about that. About the fact that he was the calmest person on this plane. While she felt like she was being unraveled, she swallowed hard. Then, before she could stop herself, she stepped closer. He noticed. He turned, waiting. Chloe hesitated, her hands clenched at her sides. Then, softly, carefully, she said, "I'm sorry." A beat of silence. Then he nodded, slow and deliberate. "I know." She exhaled, something breaking inside her. But he wasn't done. His eyes held hers, steady and unreadable. Then, he said, "But that's not enough." Chloe felt her breath catch. She wanted to say, "I know." She wanted to say, "Tell me how to fix it." But there was no fixing this. No undoing it. There was only what came next. The plane touched down, tires screaming against the runway. Passengers stirred, stretching, reaching for their bags, their minds already on the next thing. But Chloe stayed still, the weight of his words pressing down on her. That's not enough. Because it was never just about this moment. It was about all the moments before it. All the ones that would come after. And whether she would keep looking away. Or whether, for the first time in her life, she would choose to see. The end.